Okay, hopefully this will work. I don't know, I just had to stop it. I got a call from a friend, so I'm starting up again. Neanderthals, or starting where I left off. So Neanderthals had long heads, very long heads that went back quite a ways. There still are, I mean, not anybody with Neanderthal DNA, but I'd say most people who have a lot of Neanderthal DNA still have this type of head. There was a study done in somewhere in Europe where they basically compared Neanderthal DNA level of Neanderthal DNA to similarity of morphology to Neanderthaloids, and they found that consistently the people with the most Neanderthal DNA tended to have the longest heads that were shaped the most similarly to a Neanderthal. So the major exception to this rule is in East Asia, that what are called, historically were called Mongoloid people, basically East Asian people have a lot of Neanderthal DNA, potentially more than anybody else in Eurasia, but they have less Neanderthaloid morphology for some reason. And the reason for that is a bit mysterious, but I mean, the main Neanderthal trait that they do have in spades is that they have very large brains. Like East Asian people have huge brains compared to their body size. So that's a Neanderthal, in that sense, they are more Neanderthaloid than the rest of Eurasia for the most part. But I think in every country, there's far from any kind of uniformity of level of Neanderthal DNA. And there's tends to be certain certain bloodlines, certain families that have a lot of Neanderthal DNA, and others that have almost none. So, and I think, the fact that they had huge brains, I think helped them to create what we consider to be like human civilization. It helped them to get the ball rolling on a lot of this complex science and technology that we have. I think they probably, I kind of doubt they invented astronomy. I think there's a good chance Homo erectus and other hominins already made use of astronomy on some level, just because it's kind of an obvious thing to do. But I suspect that Neanderthals, and possibly Denisovans as well, which were Siberian and Asian hominin, closer related to Heidelbergensis, that they, or at least Neanderthal, added significantly to the astronomical knowledge and science of early man. And yeah, I think that Göbekli Tepe is in many respects a direct result of Neanderthal science and civilization. But, and as my friend and colleague Andrew Collins has often said, it may be the actual hybridization itself between sapiens and Neanderthal which created civilization. The blend of the kind of two perspectives led to something bigger. And I would say that much of that is good, in the sense that it's given us our greatest building blocks for understanding the world and surviving, and you know, building up knowledge, but at the same time, I think it was also catastrophic in that it, like, we don't, I mean, that could partly be why we are destroying ourselves so quickly, is because we are given a scientific culture from a species that is extinct, that had brains that were up to 30% larger than ours, had eyes that were like twice the size of ours and or more. Like they were sensory supermen. You know, their ears were twice the size of ours at least. Their eyes, their nose, their mouth, their tongue, their hands. They and they felt more. You know, they had a greater ability to feel pain. They could feel more pain, and they could tolerate it. You know, they basically just were, sensory supermen. They were able to smell, taste, see, feel much more than we can. And then they had this enormous brain, and they were able to, you know, probably develop a lot of the basis of human kind of astronomy and, you know, religion. It's hard to know exactly like what are the exact things that were handed down from them. I mean, we know that there were certain types of tools that, and you know, there were certain things that we find first among the Neanderthals, like glue. The earliest instances of glue seem to be among the Neanderthals. The earliest musical instruments, apparently, there are some of the earliest bone tools. But it's hard to know exactly what all the specifics were, but I just think there was a huge influence. Part of why I think there was a huge influence is not just because of the fact, I mean, already the bare facts of it would lead me to suspect that this huge brain species interbreeds with a smaller brain species, which is us, and creates, and then all of a sudden all this, you know, intense civilization appears. I mean, that would already lead me to suspect Neanderthal influence. But the fact that that the ancient civilizations themselves basically worshipped Neanderthaloid. I mean, at least a lot of the ancient civilizations seem to have, you know, in a sense, either worship Neanderthals or worship Neanderthaloids. Like, if you look at, you know, the fact that all the ancient people, starting at Göbekli Tepe, you know, Karalhoyuk, Derinkuyu, or not Derinkuyu, but I mean, all the like Neolithic sites, you know, what is it? Not Jerusalem, but okay, well, whatever the Levantine kind of Israeli city is, Jericho. You know, Jericho, Göbekli Tepe, Karalhoyuk, you know, all the early sites of where we find the first agriculture, where we find the first domesticated cows, where we find the first domesticated goats, etc. You know, the first domesticated wheat. All these sites, the elites in these places, you know, that have the most elaborate burials, have elongated heads, artificially elongated heads. They would wrap their babies' heads, either wrap them in some kind of cloth or use a cradle board or something to, when the baby's head was soft, to basically turn the baby into a Neanderthal morphologically in terms of their cranial morphology. And as time went on, they started to really, experiment with it. So you have some that are the normal, look like Neanderthals, their heads go straight back. You have others where their heads almost go straight up. You have others where they manipulated the skulls to their heads to basically just balloon out in all directions. But most of these cases, and certainly most of the earliest ones, are making these people more Neanderthaloid. It's making these people who were primarily Neanderthaloid hybrids, or maybe all of them were Neanderthaloid hybrids, but it's making them look even more Neanderthaloid. It's making at least their head look more like a pure Neanderthal. And so that tells me, and I think in the Egyptian tradition, in a lot of the different traditions, they say that this was done to aid intelligence and memory. And I think memory is thought to be seated in the cerebellum, or into like the part of the brain that was larger with Neanderthals and would maybe potentially be enlarged if you elongate your head. It's hard to know exactly what effect the cranial neanderthalization had on these children and on these people, but I think it would be a mistake to say that these people were just stupid and crazy and that they were just destroying their children. It's not anything anybody should try to do, but at the same time, these children grew up to be the rulers of the planet for at least 12,000 years straight. Up until, I'd say the first empire that wasn't ruled by people with elongated heads is possibly the Greeks. Certainly the Egyptians had elongated heads, the Phoenicians had elongated heads. So I think the Greeks were the first kind of like people to stop doing that and be the rulers of the world. But almost all the Greek sciences came from elongated head people, whether it was the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians. Agriculture comes from these people. So, people might look at cradle boarding among the Mengbetu in Africa, Nigeria or whatever, and they might think like, oh, these stupid people, they're just trying to mimic the gods, and they don't know what they're doing. But the fact is, they know how to shape a skull, which is kind of impressive, and most people can't even fathom like what that is or means. But also people like the Mengbetu, like the pharaohs of Egypt, had elongated heads, and they built the pyramids, and no person with a normal head, like, I'm not saying they were able to do it because they had elongated heads. I'm just saying that before we get super judgmental against them as being superstitious idiots, I would like to see one person without an elongated head build Khufu's pyramid, replicate Khufu's pyramid. Then you can talk, Like, I would not suggest like replicating any of that, but there is a good chance that there was some positive effect, whatever it was. You know, the Egyptians said they elongated their heads to retain part of their souls. It's either their ka or their ba, or you know, in the Egyptian culture, was like 3 or 4 or 5 different aspects of the soul. So I'm not sure which part of the soul was preserved by elongating the head, but it could be that they knew some of the pitfalls of hybridization. They knew how hybridization can sometimes cause problems. Maybe they even knew about all the cancers and diseases that we now know come from hybridization. Maybe the skull elongation was some way to bypass some of the pitfalls of some of the side effects of hybridization. I mean, that's a question. That's not, obviously that wouldn't be enough reason to headbind a child, but I think it was more complicated than just to say they were superstitious and dumb and so they abused their children. I think they not only worshiped Neanderthals and Neanderthal DNA on some level, but they also probably knew of some tangible benefit to elongating heads. Otherwise, it's hard to imagine why they would, you know, that basically the people who created everything in our world, like created agriculture, created money, created science, created everything else. They did this every single generation for basically like 10,000 years. I find it unlikely that they did it for no reason, or that they did it only because they worshipped the Neanderthals, or that they just worshipped Neanderthal DNA. I think it was something more practical. So the Neanderthals basically lived until about 40,000 years ago. I think the most recent Neanderthal fossil that we can find is about 40,000 years old, but they might have lived longer somewhere else that we just haven't, you know, that either their fossils decomposed too quick or we just haven't found their fossils, either somewhere in the Arctic or around Gibraltar or somewhere else in the Mediterranean. But you know, like if you look at not only through the skull elongation, like head elongation was practiced by the pharaohs, it was practiced in Mesopotamia, it was practiced in the Levant, it was practiced by the Guanches in you know, the Canary Islands, it was probably practiced by the you know, the Berbers in general, the Amazigh, although I'm not sure about that, but the fact that the Guanches were basically Berbers suggests that. It was practiced throughout Europe, you know, it's practiced by the Ostrogoths, certainly by the Huns apparently, or people related to the Huns or associated with the Huns. It was practiced up in France until, you know, into the 1800s at least, especially in Toulouse. It was practiced, you know, by the Inca, the Maya, the Aztec, the you know, pretty much everybody, you know, all up until in the US, like American Indians in the US practiced it, American Indians in Canada practiced it. You know, the Indus Valley civilization of ancient Pakistan practiced it in a very extreme way. The ancient Mesopotamians, of course, practiced it. So, yeah, basically the people who ruled the world, the people who ruled ancient Asia, the people who ruled ancient Europe, the people who ruled ancient Africa, the people who ruled ancient South America, and the people who ruled ancient North America all artificially elongated their heads. You know, they all had artificially elongated heads, artificially artificially neonatally neanderthalized crania. And so that tells me a lot about the reverence that in which they held the Neanderthals. Because, I mean, all these very advanced civilizations were heavily Neanderthaloid, like the Sumerians. If you look at their art, especially the early art, like early dynastic, pre-dynastic, like almost everybody in that art is so Neanderthaloid that they would be like kids, you know, they would be like a freak today. They would not be recognized as a normal person today because they had like such a long nose that either projected so far forward or just was so large in general that, I mean, just look at you know, any of the early dynastic, pre-dynastic, look at the Warka vase of Inanna. You know, a lot of the depictions of Inanna showed a very Neanderthaloid features. A lot of the Arada civilization, you know, Giraffe depicted very heavily Neanderthaloid deities. So they would not be worshipping Neanderthaloid deities if they were ashamed of their Neanderthaloid heritage, you know, their Neanderthal ancestry, or if it was somehow antithetical to the religion that they were following. You know, on the contrary, it suggests that Neanderthals were central to the religion that they were following. So, you know, a lot of this, like, this is not convenient for anybody because you either have the people who have been basically controlling the world for the last, you know, 500 years, basically Europeans, they don't want to hear this for the most part, partly because they know that a lot of like Middle Easterners and even North Africans and Asians and other people have just as long or longer noses or more Neanderthaloid morphology than they do, you know. So basically like a European, like a pure Aryan, you know, blonde, blue-eyed with a little cute button nose is a pure African, is a pure you know, albino African, basically, compared to the thousands and probably millions of Africans who have Neanderthaloid morphology, who have long noses, you know, commonly found among the Maasai, among the Ethiopians, among the Sudanese, among Egyptians, among, you know, Libyans and Moroccans, and even on into Nigeria and Rwanda. You see like people with heavily Neanderthaloid morphology in any of these countries that have more, you know, more markedly Neanderthaloid morphology than a lot of people in Europe. So this is not convenient for like European nationalists, which have been really the ones dominating the world and dominating science for the last, you know, few hundred years. I mean, for instance, there's a lot of jealousy between the kind of quote unquote Aryan Christian people and the Jewish, like, quote unquote, you know, Semitic people. I mean, besides the fact that some of the you know, some people argue that a lot of the Jewish ancestry comes from the you know, Khazaria or something, which is basically a Turkish empire that was centered in the middle of the Aryan Empire. So, but beyond all that, just the fact that um, Jewish people are part of the same Caucasoid, overarching kind of family uh, of nations, and that the Caucasoid family of nations, you could say, stretches well into Africa, and I mean, that being nations that contain significant amount of like Neanderthaloid, Caucasoid people. Like I would say, in that sense, a lot of the Maasai are more Caucasoid and more Neanderthaloid, and in a sense more European than a lot of people that live in Europe, and especially more than the what are called the kind of pure Aryan, blonde, blue-eyed, button-nosed people who, I mean, they're great, they're fine, they're as great as anybody else, but they are essentially just their morphology is essentially African. And if they should be proud of anything, they should just be proud to be African and be sapient. And but for Neanderthals, I think that there are divisions right now between people with more or less Neanderthal DNA. Like I think that if it wasn't, I think that's part of the division between Europe and Europeans and Africans. But it's so convoluted by the fact that, like on one hand, there actually is somewhat of a real division genetically and morphologically between the relatively more Neanderthaloid Europe and the relatively more sapioid Africa. But at the same time, the majority of the people in both places are more sapioid. Nobody in either place is a pure Neanderthal, and nobody in either place is even really a Cro-Magnon that really would like an ancient hybrid. So relatively speaking, we're all Africans, we're all new immigrants from Africa to Europe. And like that's like for me myself, like I'm very interested in the Neanderthals because I believe that in many respects they had an intelligence that I don't have and that nobody I've ever met has probably had. But I don't worship them. I don't see them as any way morally superior to me, nor do I think anybody has any moral superiority by being their descendants. I mean, part of this I stress just because of the kind of ongoing nationalist, squabbling online between people who use Neanderthal DNA and the Neanderthal science either as a way to bolster up white supremacy or as a way to demonize all white people. Like, I think that the truth is that we're all cousins, we're all interrelated, and the more we can understand both sapiens and Neanderthal, like the more we like, for one thing, I think a lot of what we did derive from Neanderthals, a lot of the advanced science, a lot of the art, a lot of the symbolism has been just repackaged as this is sapiens invented this, we're the best, you're welcome or whatever. Whereas really we got it from people that don't exist anymore, that basically we either killed off or bred out. And in that sense, we should have a little humility. But I certainly don't think, I don't think somebody's superior for having more Neanderthal DNA or more sapiens DNA. I do think that people with more Neanderthal DNA have sometimes certain strengths that others don't have. Sometimes they might have a huge brain that can be, accessed for certain things that, that I like. For instance, I know that I don't have a large brain. I know from the contours of my skull, I have you can see kind of a point on the top, and you can see two kind of side points here. So that shows that I have basically a similar skull morphology to Homo erectus, and maybe some of the Heidelbergensis, maybe some of the maybe Ergaster as well. But basically, I have a sagittal keel, which is a shadow, vestigial, remnant of a sagittal crest, which all the Australopithecines and earlier hominins, and of course gorillas and a lot of the other primates have just like a large bony crest in the middle of the skull, which anchors large jaw muscles for the gorillas to like eat, basically eat like trees and stuff, like eat anything. So I don't have that, but I have like the vestigial sagittal keel, which means that I don't have as much space for brain. Basically, I think it was once the sagittal crest diminished, the brain was able to grow a bit once the crest turned into a keel. And then once the keel smoothed out, then we were able to have the really huge brained hominins like the Neanderthals. So I come at this as an outsider, that even though I have a lot of Neanderthal DNA, I don't have that aspect of Neanderthal morphology. I don't have the huge brain. So I'm not here banging my own drum in any respect. If anything, I'm banging the drum of other people, banging the drum of people who've been insulted for having long noses and for, whatever the other traits are, but who actually have, I think that there's an untapped resource in a sense that people with large brains, I mean, as it is right now, you can't even really, like, if I was to go on TV right now and talk about people with large brains, they'd just kick me off. They'd be like, you're not supposed to talk about that. But like I'm saying, as somebody who has a small brain, who has a sagittal keel, so I know that I basically don't have a huge cranial capacity, but I'm not so pathetically like insecure that I can't recognize the inherent, gift of that some people have huge brains, and as long as they're not using it against me, then that's great, and that should be celebrated, and that should be welcomed and tapped into, and people who have smaller brains like me, I mean, I would like to think on some level we should catch a break. We should say like, okay, here we've been trying to follow in the footsteps of these Neolithic, civilization. Civilization was laid down by people with brains like twice the size of mine.